Good night, I'm called Daniel and I live in Esperantina. These things that I will tell happened with my grandfather at the time he lived for the bands of Santa Rosa, which is a few km away. My grandfather lived many years in this place and had all his children in his wooden house that until today must still be there. That house in question had been achieved in a deal he had done with the compadre of him. The man changed the house and land and a good gun that my grandfather had and was forced to live elsewhere. In the last years of his life he moved to Esperantina, where my father, already adult, managed to get a job. I still grew up hearing many stories that he lived in his youth, both before and after he began to live in those brinas full of sights. This compadre of my grandfather was not well a compadre, but rather a cousin who he had when they were young. The two used to work in society, and always when one was standing the other called to spend some time working anywhere away from home. That the two-made business had been given by a boss of my grandfather's cousin in payment for a job he had done in the week. He decided to pass the house to my grandfather. The two were working together on a plot of land that the owner wanted to build and asked if he knew anyone else to help in the service. At the time he indicated my grandfather, but said he needed a day to go pick up because they were going back to work. My grandfather accepted at the time because this cousin of his always had opportunities to earn something to support himself. He was very alive for business and not stopped at home for a while. After all the service was done, my grandfather was preparing to go home when this cousin asked what it was that he kept hanging by a cord facing the side of my back. Grandpa said it was a revolver 32, and soon he asked to take a look at that gun. Admired with the revolver, the boy returned price and insisted so much that my grandfather got bored with him, but he didn't leave my grandfather leave without before closing the deal. When he got up to go away and at about 50 met, the cousin yelled and told him to hope that now they make the deal. The proposal was that he offered that house because he spent more time in the middle of the world than right there, and then he had no responsibility in life and his money was for these things. Even after they finished the business, the cousin before then just said that he took care, and the boy who lived there also. My grandfather did not understand anything he said and just made an ugly face to the side and left with the key of the door home. The next week moved from his father's house and was living in the residence that had negotiated with my cousin. My grandfather was the kind who was not afraid of anything, and it really was right on the first day that he arrived at the house that went down from a donkey. He hadn't opened the door. Soon he saw a boy who was in the corner of the wall. Of get up and walk out the corridor that gave access to a room and the rest of the house. But boy is not who is a boy here, even if it's what you do here, kid, asked my grandfather without any. But the boy kept walking without saying a word and disappeared under the shadow of a table that it was the only mobile. That night my grandfather, even knowing that house could be haunted, the first week he spent there was one of the hardest weeks he had, cause he always saw that boy passing behind him and throwing it on the ground. The few things he still had that same week. My grandfather went to visit his parents and ended up telling everything he spent in that house, and that at night there was something that seemed a person drinking water from his pot. In case of my great-grandmother, who always, it was a spiritualized woman, advised him to light a candle for that sight, but he did it in a place far away from his house so that the prayer would be right. Then when he came to home, remembered to buy the said candles and do what his mother had told him. The problem is that my grandfather was not a very easy person to deal with and always did things his way. That night when he came in home, the first thing he did was to make such a prayer and light the candle. He thought he would not go to the middle of the bush just to do that, and that it was silly, those things his mother said. Being so, when he spoke the words he had learned and lit the candle, at the same instant he felt a weight on his shoulder and a heavy breath in his left ear. At the time he was sure that he had made a big mess. That weight on his shoulder was stronger, and he gradually began to feel bad and weak. With that all, a shiver ran through his whole body, but he told that he did not feel any fear of what, only worried about his life and his head would die there alone and suffocated with that creature clinging to his shoulder. And almost it really happened, for that business made strength, and he's been blowing in his ear gave half night. He never knew what it was that really, but he said that the thing did not let sit in nor lay, that dragged him from the door of the room to the kitchen door for hours and made with him as if he does with a horse light of the lantern he had showed on the wall. That there was a shadow above him, but he could not distinguish the shape it had when it gave. So about 12 hours that it released him with force in the corner of the wall and disappeared like a wind. And that night he couldn't sleep, haunted by fear that it would come to catch him Again, but he knew it had been some bullshit he'd done. As soon as the cock sang, he rode on his ass and was knocking at his parents' house and telling everything happened. When the mother heard what the son had done, she got very angry because he had said exactly how he should do it, was that he did not listen to people and did everything your way. Mother, he said that he should never have lit that candle inside the house because everything in it would be drawn towards that light. Also had another problem that my grandfather had, that was not tell the full story and always said a version that did not throw all the blame on him. He did not say that the sight had mounted on him and that almost killed him, suffocated standing on his back almost all night, and my great-grandmother never knew not half the things he did coming home. My grandfather was very worried that that thing came at night to mount on him as he had done last night. Stubborn the way it was, he did not back in business and nor abandoned his home, and the land that had obtained with some ease was easier that aimed to give up than I said it. When he came home he thought he could say the prayer again, but that this time would look for a place far away to light that candle. Thought for an instant, but did not want to risk with that thing that appeared the other time, precisely because he had lit that candle. After a while thinking, he decided not to take the risk and lie down to see what happened. As always, the same things happened to him, still awake, but of those things he was not afraid. That night a man appeared to him in the corner of the room who he slept, coming from the corridor, and he spent all night watching with his hands on his face. He told that the man was Lo Moreno and did not let him see his face in any way. My grandfather told him to go, although and asked what he wanted, but that did not pronounce a word. Were many things that he experienced there until the last day that he left. There was a time that things do not appeared, more so after the arrival of his wife and children, but from time to time something was seen both inside the house and on the outskirts of the land. My father says that he does not even like to go in those lands because he says there is the haunted, and is afraid that those things will follow him and come haunt our house as they did for years in my grandfather's house. Good night. Good evening, my name is Cristiano Pires and I want to tell a story that I heard several times from the mouth of my mother Marinalva. History is very old, not even she knows exactly when it happened, but she believed in each word of the story because heard from an old father that she and my grandmother met in the mid-80s. My grandmother Raimunda worked for the Catholic Church here in Quixeramobim. She made food for the priests and also cleaned the parish house and the sacristy of the church most often. My grandmother took my mother to help her in the service, and it was then that on one occasion an old father named Custódio was passing through the city and stayed a few days resting before going to the capital where he lived. After the priest finished lunch he sat on the sofa in the living room. My mom, she was serving a coffee tea, and she, who always was curious about supernatural matters, asked the priest if the haunting existed or was something of the head of people. Father Custódio said that evil and the well are present everywhere, and until we cannot imagine how. His answer was somewhat empty. My mother asked if he had ever seen something of overnatural. My grandmother was with her and apologized to the priest for believe that my mother is disturbing him with her parun best odra. With all patience of the world asked that grandmother and my mother sit, because would report that at some adas at the time when I was young they sat down and Father Custódio began to speak. Soon after he was ordained father was to be see the purposes of the Lord Jesus in a parish in a town called São Benedito. Besides the church of city, I also gave assistance to the districts, and at that time I used all kinds of transport that was available to be able to move around the city, and sometimes I went even walking. At once I went to visit a district far away from the headquarters, and as the mass ended a little late I spent the night there. That place was even easy access because it passed on the gravel road in front of the entrance to the district. At the time had a stick of macaw that passed twice by week and took the people who lived in the region to the city. The stick of Herrera belonged to a man named Joao Buru. He always attended the masses and never charged me for travel because he said that the contribution of his was that his Joao lived in a place about half an hour from this district, and he left very early before the sun rose and people stood in front of the portarius along the road. And when the car arrived they'd climb into the body. That night I went to sleep in Casa de Dona Maria Fu. I woke up before 4 a.m. and already had a coffee and a couscous on the fire. After I ate I said goodbye to Dona Maria and took my bag and went walking to the road. Wait for the Herrera stick was not the first time I did this itinerary, and walked for about 300 m and arrived on the road, sat in a log of wood that stood under a thick tree, and I was waiting for the car to arrive. Not long I heard Noise looking like a slipper dragged and some voices coming down the road. At the time I thought it was some people who just like me were there to pick up the stick of macaw and go to the city. The moon was beautiful and still illuminated the sky, so I ended up seeing in the distance that the trace of slipper was a boy, but I could not see anyone else at the time. I strained because who talked alone in the roads could not be well of the mind. When it was of approaching I started to hear other noises. That reminded me of screams. At that time I thought it really is a crazy because I figured it was the boy who was making those noises. Like I was alone on that road. I feared for my life because who knows what he could do, so I decided to take precautions, and so I ran behind the AV and stayed hidden and silent. When he got closer I realized that boy was back. A pretty big bag, seemed to be rag type, that kept cereal, and it seemed to have someone or something screaming inside of it. If it was the cry of a small child I might even think that man went crazy and had stolen someone's son, and if it was animal he could have stolen from somewhere. But the sounds were not just screams, had several voices, as if many people were trapped inside that bag that man carried and were hoarse, seemed weeping despair, not to mention that some were not in our language or one I knew. When he was a few meters from the tree I saw that inside the bag there were more pointed parts as if they were bones. He stopped in front of me where I was looking at the direction and left the bag on the ground as if it was resting from that weight, and said something to me, only I couldn't understand. At that moment I knew that it was not a thing of this world, and even though I had prepared for so many years to preach the word and the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ, I did not know how to deal with that situation. The only thing that I did was hold me with my faith, because I had lost until the forces of the body. My legs softened and I sat with my back anchored in the tree without being able to move. Believed that I entered state of shock. That boy stood still and not if moved. I prayed with faith, but it did not come out, so I reconstituted and the forces were returning, and when I managed to get up I created courage and went behind the tree and was walking towards the road. Boy was wearing old and tattered clothes, and I realized that in the bag there were really bones. Then he walked, looked back and stopped, so I felt like follow him, and he was walking up in front of a cemetery in the district that stood on the edge of road. When he came forward he went in and disappeared. At the time I was sure that boy carried some curse that crossed the barrier between life and death, and he was needing of help to follow his way in peace. I returned to the stop, and before even reaching the lighthouses saw the light of the macaw stick of his John the First. Went on the ride with him, and during the journey to the city I asked him if he already had heard that it is something supernatural appeared on those roads. He was out of the way, but then reported to me that some people said they had seen a marmot of a man carrying a bag that there was screaming out, so I understood it was the same thing that I had seen the other month. I organized a novena in the district with prayers to keep those things off the road, and only a few people knew the real reason for the novena, but after that no one else saw that shading, paying penance and Estat. After this Hisacantio, Father, my mother passed these, and still today she has not met. And if we saw anything, the best thing to do is pray and cling to God, because these things are out there and on moonlight night go to erase their penance and haunt those who meet by the way. Good night.